April 29, 1943, 600 German soldiers stepped off trucks at a hastily built camp near Powell, Oklahoma, and I remember hearing about it from my uncle who worked for the Corps of Engineers on the Red River Project. Enemy soldiers on Texas-Oklahoma soil, young men from Rommel's Afrika Korps, desert fighters who'd battled across North Africa, now standing in the humid heat of southern Oklahoma, surrounded by trees and red mud and a river they'd never heard of. They'd come to build something impossible. Something that folks said couldn't be done during wartime, shouldn't be done with enemy labor, wouldn't hold back the Red River even if they managed to finish it. But you won't believe what those 600 Germans accomplished over the next year and a half. What they helped create on the border between Texas and Oklahoma. What they built that still stands today, protecting millions of people from floods that would have destroyed everything. The story got told in pieces over the decades. Engineers who supervised the work shared memories at professional conferences. Local folks who watched enemy soldiers clearing brush along the river told their children about it. A German prisoner named Manfred, who came back decades later, wrote letters describing his time at Camp Denison, explaining what it felt like to be a captured soldier building America's infrastructure. And if you put it all together, if you listen to all those voices, you get something remarkable, something nobody expected, a story about enemies working together to tame one of the meanest rivers in America. The Red River earned its name honestly, flows 1,260 miles from the high plains of eastern New Mexico all the way to Louisiana, where it joins the Mississippi. Red clay soil colors the water rusty brown, gives it that distinctive muddy appearance. Most of the time the red runs slow and lazy, barely navigable above Alexandria, sometimes drying to a trickle during droughts. But when spring rains hit the watershed, when snowmelt from the Rockies combines with thunderstorms across Texas and Oklahoma, the red turns mean. Floods that destroyed towns, killed families, and wiped out entire agricultural regions. Two floods particularly devastated the region. One in 1848 swept away everything along the riverbanks from the headwaters to Louisiana. Another in 1908 killed dozens, left thousands homeless, caused damage that took years to repair. The Red had a reputation. Folks along its banks lived with the constant threat that next spring might bring catastrophe. Then in 1925, a Denison businessman named George Moulton had an idea. He just returned from out west, where people talked about a massive dam project on the Colorado River, what would become Hoover Dam. Moulton was the stepson of Colonel J.B. McDougal, one of Denison's business tycoons, and he'd grown up watching what the Red could do when it flooded. Seen homes swept away, seen families destroyed, seen entire communities rebuilt multiple times. So Moulton sat down and wrote a letter to Oklahoma Congressman Charles Carter requesting topographic maps of the Red River Valley. He wasn't an engineer by training, had no formal education in dam construction or hydrology, but he understood concepts, had studied geology, knew how to read maps. When those maps arrived, he studied them for weeks, translating contour lines into elevations, finding the perfect spot for a dam. Bears Ferry, 4 miles northwest of Denison, where the river ran between high banks, where bedrock lay close enough to the surface to provide solid foundation, where the valley widened enough to create a massive reservoir. Moulton marked the spot on his maps, wrote detailed proposals, lobbied congressmen and senators for funding. Spent years pushing his dream of a dam that would finally control the Red River. Years passed. Moulton kept lobbying, kept pushing, kept gathering support. Then in 1938, Congress passed the Flood Control Act and included funding for the Denison Dam project. The Army Corps of Engineers set up the Denison District Office in June, appointed Captain Lucius D. Clay as first commander. Clay would later become famous, become a general, play crucial roles in World War II, but in 1938, he was just a captain overseeing surveys for a dam most people thought impossible. The Corps engineers examined the terrain for months, studied dozens of potential sites, always came back to the same location George Moulton had identified years earlier. Bears Ferry. The man who wasn't an engineer had gotten it exactly right. Construction began August 22, 1939. The dam would be enormous, largest rolled earth-filled dam in the world when completed. 18.8 million cubic yards of dirt, compacted and rolled layer by layer into an embankment that would stretch across the Red River Valley. Powerhouse at one end to generate electricity, spillway to handle floodwaters, outlet works to control water release. A construction project so massive it seemed impossible even in peacetime. Then December 7, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor, America entered the war. Suddenly the Denison Dam project competed with military needs for workers, materials, equipment. Young men left construction jobs to join the military or work in defense plants. The massive earth-moving project slowed as labor shortages hit hard. By early 1943, the Corps faced a serious problem: not enough workers to finish the dam on schedule. 30,000 acres of land still needing to be cleared before the reservoir could fill. Then something unexpected happened that would change everything. If you are new here, I welcome you to my channel and to a true World War II story in which ordinary people were pushed into moments that tested their fear, courage, and humanity. My name is Dr. Franklin Carter. I'm 80 years old, a retired military veteran, and I have been telling war stories for many years. If you are ready to follow me through these stories of war, then kindly like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you can see other episodes when they're released. Also, tell me where you are watching from and what exact time you are watching right now. This story is just starting, so sit down and follow me to the end. In May 1943, Rommel's Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia. The German commander who'd earned the nickname Desert Fox, who'd pushed British and American forces across North Africa for years, finally got trapped between Allied armies advancing from east and west. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their weapons all at once. More prisoners than America knew what to do with. The War Department needed places to house them, ways to use them. Geneva Convention required prisoners be held in climates similar to where they were captured. North African desert fighters needed hot, dry environments. Texas and Oklahoma fit perfectly. Better yet, those states desperately needed agricultural workers and laborers for infrastructure projects. Perfect match. The first German prisoners arrived in Texas in April 1943, filled camps across the state by summer. Then somebody at the War Department had an idea. The Denison Dam project needed workers. German POWs needed work assignments. Why not put captured Afrika Korps soldiers to work clearing land for the massive reservoir that would be created when the dam finally closed? April 29, 1943, 600 Germans arrived at a brand new POW camp near Powell, Oklahoma, 2 miles south of the small town. Another camp opened at Tishomingo. Later, a third camp would be built right at the spillway site. The prisoners were young, most in their 20s, veterans of brutal desert warfare who'd fought across Libya and Tunisia. Panzer crew members, infantry, support personnel, disciplined, trained, experienced soldiers who now found themselves clearing trees in Oklahoma humidity. My Uncle Jim worked for the Corps of Engineers during this period, supervised some of the clearing operations, and interacted with the German work crews daily. He said the Germans were shocked by Oklahoma when they first arrived. They'd been captured in the desert, held in temporary camps in North Africa, shipped across the Atlantic, processed through ports on the East Coast, transported by train across America. For days, they'd ridden trains through American cities and farmland, watching normal life continue while war raged overseas. Couldn't believe what they were seeing. Most had lived through turmoil their entire lives. Depression-era Germany, Hitler's rise, war mobilization, combat. Seeing Americans living peaceful, normal lives amazed them. The work was backbreaking. 30,000 acres needed clearing before the reservoir could fill. Trees to cut down, brush to remove, buildings to demolish, entire communities to relocate. The town of Aylesworth would be submerged when the lake filled. Most of Finchtown would disappear underwater. Oil wells in the Cumberland field near Medill needed protecting or capping. Roads needed rerouting. Cemeteries needed moving. Bodies carefully exhumed and reburied on higher ground. The Germans worked 6 days a week clearing land, axes and saws felling trees, chains and trucks dragging timber, crews burning slash piles. They worked the Texas side and Oklahoma side both, following the Corps engineers' maps showing exactly what elevation the reservoir would reach, what lands would flood. 3,600 acres near the dam site required especially intensive clearing, every tree removed, every stump pulled, ground leveled for future recreational development. Geneva Convention prohibited prisoners from working on actual military construction, on weapons production, on anything directly related to the war effort. But clearing land for a flood control reservoir, building drainage ditches, constructing restrooms for future park visitors, all allowed. The Germans did lighter construction work too, laying stone in mortared drainage ditches around the dam site. Work that's still visible today if you know where to look. Hand-laid stone from 1943 and 1944, placed by enemy soldiers who never thought they'd be building American infrastructure. They earned 80 cents per day in canteen coupons. The government paid contractors $1.50 for each prisoner's labor, pocketed the 70-cent difference to help fund the POW program. 80 cents doesn't sound like much, but prisoners could buy cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing supplies. Some saved their coupons for months to buy special items, small luxuries that made captivity more bearable. Officers weren't required to work under Geneva Convention rules. A German sergeant named Manfred arrived at Camp Denison in May 1945, found himself exempt from manual labor because of his rank. He'd just completed sergeant training at Camp Brady in Texas, thought he'd spend the war in comfortable idleness. But watching other prisoners work, seeing what they were building, he felt conflicted. Should he maintain military privilege or contribute to something useful? The camps themselves were basic but adequate. Wooden barracks similar to what American servicemen lived in. Mess halls where Germans cooked their own food, elected their own officers, ran their own compounds to a large extent. High fences and guard towers for security, but the guards were mostly older men, veterans from the First War, or men with injuries that kept them from combat duty. They weren't eager to create problems, understood that keeping prisoners cooperative meant treating them fairly. The relationship between guards and prisoners evolved over months of daily contact. Initial suspicion gave way to routine. Routine became familiarity. Familiarity sometimes became something close to friendship, though nobody would use that word. Guards learned prisoners' names, understood their personalities, picked up bits of German. Prisoners learned English, adapted to American work rhythms, figured out which guards were strict, and which looked the other way for minor infractions. Then something started happening that nobody expected, something that would test everyone involved. You won't believe the complications that arose as the work progressed. The dam construction itself faced constant challenges. Building the world's largest rolled earth dam during wartime meant improvising constantly. Materials arrived late or in wrong quantities. Equipment broke down, and replacement parts took months to acquire. Civilian workers quit for better-paying defense jobs. Weather didn't cooperate. Heavy rains made earth moving impossible for days at a time. But the prisoner work crews remained remarkably steady. 600 Germans at Powell, more at Tishomingo, later more at the Spillway camp. They showed up every morning, worked their shifts, returned to camp every evening. Escape attempts were rare. Germans understood they were in the middle of America with nowhere to go. A few tried anyway, cut through fences at night, made runs for freedom. All were recaptured within days. The landscape worked against escape, flat farmland for miles in every direction, small towns where strangers stood out immediately, local law enforcement eager to help catch enemy soldiers. The clearing work progressed through summer and fall, 1943, into winter, through spring 1944. Thousands of acres transformed from forest to bare ground. Engineers marked specific elevations on trees. Germans cut everything below those marks. The future lake's outline emerged gradually, shoreline taking shape as clearing advanced. Local folks watched the German prisoners with mixed feelings. Some objected, thought enemies shouldn't be treated well, shouldn't be paid, shouldn't get adequate food while American soldiers fought overseas. Newspaper editorials occasionally complained about German POWs living better than they deserved. But farmers understood the practical reality. Without prisoner labor, the crops wouldn't get harvested. The dam project would fall further behind schedule. The Germans filled a desperate need, even if it felt wrong employing enemy soldiers. My Uncle Jim told me about an incident that summed up the complicated relationships that developed. Summer 1944, brutal heat, temperatures over 100 degrees, humidity making it feel even worse. A German work crew clearing brush along what would become the shoreline, their guard an older man named Frank Harrison from Medill. Harrison had fought in France during the First War, carried a piece of German shrapnel in his leg that still bothered him, had every reason to hate Germans. But that afternoon, watching young German soldiers work in dangerous heat, seeing them struggle with exhaustion and dehydration, Harrison called a break earlier than regulations allowed. Told the crew to rest in shade, shared his own water canteen with them. One German, couldn't have been more than 19 years old, thanked Harrison in broken English. Thanked him for kindness, for treating them like human beings instead of animals. Harrison later told Jim that moment stayed with him forever. This boy who looked like Harrison's own son, thanking him for basic decency, made Harrison realize enemy soldiers were just young men caught in something beyond their control, same as American boys fighting in Europe. Didn't make the war right, didn't excuse German aggression, but complicated the simple narrative of good versus evil. Those moments happened throughout the project, small acts of humanity between captors and captives. Guards sharing cigarettes with prisoners, work crews teaching each other phrases in German and English. Germans carving small wooden figures during evening hours, giving them as gifts to guards who'd treated them fairly. Connections forming despite the war, despite everything that should have kept them separated. Then January 1944 arrived, and everything changed. The dam was complete, final load of dirt placed October 18, 1943. Cofferdam dismantled. On January 6, 1944, the Red River began impounding behind the massive earthen barrier. Water started backing up, creating what would eventually become Lake Texoma. The reservoir would take 15 months to reach normal elevation of 617 feet above sea level. 15 months of watching water gradually flood the cleared land, submerge roads and buildings and landmarks, transform the landscape completely. George Moulton came to the shore sometime after impounding began. 75 years old, the man who'd dreamed of this dam since 1925, who'd lobbied Congress for years, who'd pushed the project through skepticism and opposition. He stood at the water's edge with a reporter from the Denison Herald. Picked up a pebble, tossed it into the rising lake, watched ripples spread and disappear. Turned to the reporter and said quietly, "Well, that's that." Moulton died December 14, 1944, just months after seeing his life's work completed. Never knew the full impact his dam would have, the millions of people it would protect, the floods it would prevent, the hydroelectric power it would generate, the recreation it would provide. Just knew he'd finished what he started 20 years earlier. The German prisoners kept working through 1944, maintained the cleared areas, built additional facilities, helped with final landscaping. But by fall, the project no longer needed their labor in large numbers. Powell camp closed September 1944. Prisoners transferred to other facilities, other projects. Tishomingo prisoners relocated to the Spillway camp for a while longer. Then they too were reassigned. By early 1945, most of the German POWs who'd cleared land for Lake Texoma had moved to other locations in Texas and Oklahoma. A smaller group remained at Camp Denison near the dam through most of 1945, performing maintenance work, building stone-lined drainage ditches, constructing restroom facilities. Manfred, the German sergeant, was among them, working despite his rank, because the remaining projects needed his engineering knowledge. He later wrote about watching massive trucks being transported through Denison, army vehicles from the European theater cleaned and parked in enormous fields south of town. Counted thousands of trucks, more than he'd seen during his entire time in the German military. Made him realize the scale of American industrial capacity, understood why Germany couldn't win a war against such overwhelming resources. Summer 1945, the war in Europe ended. Germany collapsed, Hitler dead, cities in ruins. German prisoners at Denison expected immediate repatriation, thought they'd finally go home. But President Truman kept them in America through 1945 and into 1946, used them to fill labor shortages until American soldiers returned from overseas. The Germans felt bitter about the delay, wanted to see families they hadn't seen in 3 or 4 years, and wanted to help rebuild their destroyed country. But they had no choice, no power to change their situation. Those last months were strange according to men who were there. Germans knowing the war was over, working American projects while their families struggled in occupied Germany. Reading letters describing starvation and chaos, unable to help. Some preferred staying in America, where they had food and shelter and safety. Germany in 1945 and early 1946 was a nightmare. Others desperately wanted to go home regardless of conditions, felt they'd abandoned their families by remaining prisoners in America. Camp Denison finally closed, last prisoners transferred January 1946. The wooden buildings were dismantled, sold at public auction. Equipment, water tanks, motors, pumps, everything sold to local farmers and ranchers. The land itself returned to private ownership. Today nothing remains of the camp except a few concrete foundations and the remains of a water well. The drainage ditches the Germans built with hand-laid stone are still there, still functional, still directing water flow around the dam, exactly as Corps engineers planned 80 years ago. Lake Texoma filled to normal elevation March 15, 1945. Official dedication ceremony held July 1, 1944. Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn giving the main address. Rayburn had pushed hard for the dam project, used his political influence to secure funding and keep construction moving during wartime. Called it one of the most important flood control projects in American history. Wasn't wrong. The dam started producing hydroelectric power March 1945. First turbine came online, second turbine operational September 1949. The reservoir became a recreation destination almost immediately, people flooding to the new lake for fishing, boating, swimming. By the 1950s, Lake Texoma was attracting millions of visitors annually, became one of the most popular recreation spots in the Southwest. But the real measure of the dam's success was flood control. The Red River had terrorized communities along its banks for centuries. After Denison Dam closed, major flooding ended. The dam held back spring floods, controlled water release, protected downstream communities from catastrophic damage. Only 5 times has water reached the spillway elevation of 640 feet, 1957, 1990, 2007, and twice in 2015. Each time the dam did exactly what it was designed to do, held back floods that would have destroyed everything downstream. Engineers estimate Denison Dam prevented billions of dollars in flood damage over its operational lifetime. Saved countless lives, protected communities, farms, infrastructure across Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana. The massive earthen barrier German prisoners helped build became one of the most successful flood control projects in American history. Then in the 1960s and 70s, some of those German prisoners started coming back to visit. Manfred the sergeant returned, brought his family, showed them where he'd been held, where he'd worked. Wrote letters to former guards and supervisors, maintained connections across decades and continents. Other Germans made similar pilgrimages, wanted to see what had become of the project they'd helped build. They were amazed by Lake Texoma. The cleared land they'd sweated over now covered by water, transformed into a massive recreation area. The drainage ditches they'd built with stone still functioning perfectly. The restrooms they'd constructed still being used by park visitors. Their work had lasted, had mattered, had become part of something important. The ironies weren't lost on them. Enemy soldiers building American infrastructure. Captured men from Hitler's army creating something that would protect American communities for generations. Desert fighters from North Africa taming a river in Oklahoma and Texas. The complications and contradictions of war made visible in stone drainage ditches and earthen dams. My Uncle Jim said the Denison Dam project taught him something important about war and humanity. You could fight enemies on battlefields and still work alongside them on construction sites. You could hate what a nation did and still respect individual soldiers. You could maintain security and discipline while showing basic human decency. The boundaries weren't as clear as propaganda made them seem. The local folks who watched the project understood it too. Enemy soldiers had helped build something crucial for their communities. Had worked hard, done good work, contributed to something bigger than the war. Didn't excuse German aggression, didn't minimize Nazi atrocities, but added complexity to the narrative. Made it harder to think of all Germans as evil monsters when you'd watch them build flood control infrastructure that protected your family. The complications persisted for decades. Germans who'd worked on the dam told their families about America, about the treatment they'd received, about the massive project they'd contributed to. Some expressed gratitude for fair treatment, for being allowed to do useful work instead of rotting in idleness. Others remained bitter about captivity, about being kept in America after the war ended, about missing years of their children's lives. American guards and supervisors carried similar mixed feelings. Proud of treating prisoners fairly, but uncomfortable with the connections they'd formed. Glad the dam got built, but troubled by the moral ambiguities of using enemy labor. The simple wartime narrative of good versus evil didn't fit what they'd experienced, left them with complicated memories they struggled to explain to people who hadn't been there. The Corps of Engineers documented the prisoner contributions in official reports, noted that POW labor had been crucial to completing the project on schedule. But those reports didn't capture the human dimension, the daily interactions, the moments of unexpected connection, the ways enemies became something more complicated through months of working together toward a common goal. Denison Dam stands today, still controlling Red River floods, still generating hydroelectric power, still providing recreation for millions of visitors. Lake Texoma remains one of the most popular destinations in the Southwest. The infrastructure built 80 years ago continues serving purposes its designers intended. A lasting testament to the engineering skill of the Corps of Engineers and the contractor companies who built it. And to the 600 German prisoners who cleared 30,000 acres of land, who built stone drainage ditches, who constructed facilities, who contributed labor to a project that would protect American communities for generations. Their story is part of the dam's history, even though their names don't appear on plaques or monuments, even though most people don't know enemy soldiers helped build it. That's the story that truly needs remembering about Denison Dam and Lake Texoma. Not a simple tale of American engineering triumph, but the more complicated truth about enemies working together, about the moral ambiguities of using prisoner labor, about unexpected human connections formed across the deepest divides. A story about what happens when war forces people together in circumstances that challenge simple narratives, revealing humanity in unexpected places, proving that even between enemies, basic decency sometimes emerges if we allow it. A truth that resonates still across all the decades since those German boys cleared Oklahoma brush in service of American flood control. The German prisoners established routines at Powell and Tishomingo camps, created small communities within the barbed wire fences. They cooked their own meals in camp mess halls, prepared food according to German recipes when ingredients allowed, elected their own leaders to interface with American authorities, handled internal disputes through their own non-commissioned officers, maintained cleanliness standards, Work schedules, recreational activities, card games in the evenings, prisoners sitting around makeshift tables playing skat and Schafkopf, German games they'd played since childhood. Some carved wooden figures during downtime, intricate detailed work that required only pocket knives and patience. Others wrote letters home through international channels established by the Geneva Convention, telling families they were safe in America, working on civilian projects, being treated fairly according to the rules of war. The mail system fascinated local Americans who worked at the camps. Letters going from Oklahoma to Germany through neutral countries, Switzerland usually, then distributed through German postal systems to families who might be anywhere, displaced by bombing, evacuated to countryside, living in bunkers and shelters. The replies came back the same route, taking months sometimes, carrying news from home that was often devastating. A guard named Robert Mitchell from Tishomingo remembered a young German prisoner, couldn't have been more than 20, receiving a letter in fall 1944. The boy opened it, read silently, face going pale, hands starting to shake. His entire family had died in a bombing raid on Hamburg. Parents, 2 sisters, a younger brother. His childhood home destroyed, nothing left but rubble and memories. The boy folded the letter carefully, put it in his pocket, went back to his bunk, didn't speak for 3 days. Mitchell said watching that broke something in him, made him realize these Germans weren't just enemy soldiers, they were sons and brothers missing families just like American boys overseas. The war had created this situation, dropped these young men in Oklahoma clearing brush while their families died in Europe. The absurdity and tragedy of it hit Mitchell hard, stayed with him rest of his life. Work accidents happened occasionally, axes slipping, trees falling wrong, trucks losing brakes on steep slopes. The Corps of Engineers maintained a medical facility at the main camp, treated injured prisoners alongside injured American workers. A German doctor named Klaus Bauer, captured with the Afrika Korps, worked in the camp infirmary, treating fellow prisoners. He later wrote about the irony of practicing medicine as a prisoner, helping Americans and Germans both, maintaining his oath to heal regardless of politics or war. The relationship between prisoners and local civilians remained complicated. Some Texans and Oklahomans objected to Germans being housed nearby, thought they should be treated more harshly, kept in stricter confinement. Newspaper letters to the editor occasionally complained about enemy soldiers eating well while Americans rationed food. But farmers desperate for workers appreciated having POW labor available, even if they wouldn't admit it publicly. A farmer named Harold Thompson, near Tishomingo, hired German work crews during harvest seasons. He spoke some German, learned from grandparents who'd immigrated from Bavaria, found himself conversing with prisoners about farming techniques, weather patterns, crop varieties. Discovered the Germans' new agriculture, understood the rhythms of planting and harvest, could be trusted with expensive equipment. Thompson later told his grandson about a prisoner named Fritz, who'd been a farmer in Saxony before the war. Fritz would examine Thompson's soil, feel it between his fingers, make suggestions about crop rotation and fertilization, gave advice that improved yields, helped Thompson's farm become more productive. When Fritz was transferred to another camp in early 1945, Thompson felt genuine loss, wrote letters trying to maintain contact, never received replies. The work progressed through seasons, summer heat brutal, temperatures over 100 degrees, humidity making it feel worse. Germans from North Africa understood heat, but Oklahoma humidity was different, oppressive, exhausting. Winter brought different challenges, cold rain, occasional ice storms, days when outdoor work became impossible. Spring meant floods, Red River rising, work crews watching water creep higher up the banks they'd cleared. You won't believe what happened as the dam neared completion and water started backing up behind it. January 1944, the Red River began impounding, water slowly filling the cleared basin, creating what would become Lake Texoma. The process would take 15 months, gradual rise to normal pool elevation of 617 feet above sea level. But watching it happen was remarkable. transformation from familiar landscape to massive reservoir. Towns disappeared underwater. Hagerman, Texas went first, residents having relocated months earlier, buildings demolished, everything salvageable removed. Then Aylesworth, Oklahoma, most buildings gone but a few structures left standing, slowly submerging as water rose. Woodville, Oklahoma vanished. Roads disappeared, bridges went underwater, entire communities erased from maps. The cemetery relocations had been heartbreaking work. 3,000 graves from 49 cemeteries, bodies carefully exhumed and moved to 11 new graveyards on higher ground. Families given options to have relatives move to other existing cemeteries if they preferred. Work crews treated the task with reverence, understood they were handling other families' ancestors, maintained strict standards of respect and decorum. German prisoners didn't work on cemetery relocations. That job went to specially trained American crews who understood the sensitivity involved. But some prisoners watched from distance, saw the careful handling of remains, the American respect for the dead. Made them think about their own families in Germany, about graveyards being destroyed by bombing raids, about bodies never properly buried. The psychological weight of being prisoner while your country was losing the war, while your family faced destruction, while everything familiar was being erased, that weight showed on the Germans. Some became depressed, withdrawn, stopped talking except when necessary. Others threw themselves into work, used physical labor to avoid thinking about things they couldn't control. A few found unexpected peace in Oklahoma, appreciated the distance from war's immediate horror, felt guilty about that appreciation, but couldn't deny it. American guards and supervisors learned to recognize signs of serious depression when prisoners needed intervention. The camp had basic mental health resources, counselors who spoke German, programs designed to keep prisoners occupied and engaged. Suicide was rare but happened. A few Germans couldn't handle separation from families during such catastrophic times. Each death was investigated thoroughly, reported through official channels, recorded in statistics that historians would later analyze, trying to understand the full impact of the POW program. The vast majority adjusted reasonably well, found routines, made friendships with other prisoners, discovered ways to maintain sanity. Some learned English beyond basic work vocabulary, read American newspapers and magazines, tried to understand the country that held them. Others doubled down on German identity, spoke only German, maintained rigid distance from American culture, counted days until repatriation. One prisoner named Hans Richter from the Powell camp kept a secret diary, writing in tiny script in margins of books, on scraps of paper, hiding everything carefully. After the war, he compiled his notes into a proper journal that his family preserved. In the 1980s, an American researcher found the diary, translated it, published excerpts that gave unprecedented insight into German POW experiences at the Dam project. Richter wrote about the strange disconnection of building American infrastructure while German cities burned. Described the cognitive dissonance of being treated fairly by enemies while his own government had treated him as expendable cannon fodder. Admitted finding Oklahoma beautiful despite being prisoner, appreciating the wide skies and rolling hills, feeling guilty about that appreciation. Expressed complicated feelings about American guards who showed kindness, struggled to maintain proper enemy status toward men who treated him like a human being. His diary captured something many POWs felt, but few could articulate. The war had put them in an impossible position, turned simple concepts like enemy and ally into complicated gray areas. Working alongside Americans on civilian projects created relationships that didn't fit war narratives. Discovering Americans were ordinary people, not monsters from propaganda, forced uncomfortable realizations about what they'd been fighting for. Then May 8, 1945 arrived and changed everything again. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler dead in his bunker, German armies collapsing across Europe, the 1,000-year Reich lasting exactly 12 years. The war in Europe was over. Germans at the dam camps heard the news, reacted with shock, relief, grief, complicated emotions nobody outside could fully understand. Some prisoners celebrated quietly, grateful the killing had stopped, hoping they'd finally go home. Others mourned Germany's defeat, struggled to accept their nation had lost everything. A few hardcore Nazis refused to believe it, insisted it was Allied propaganda, maintained belief in ultimate German victory even as evidence mounted. Most fell somewhere in the middle, understood the war was over, but unsure what came next. They expected immediate repatriation, thought surely now they'd be sent home to families they hadn't seen in years, to help rebuild their destroyed country. But Truman had other plans. He kept German prisoners in America through 1945 and into 1946, used them to address ongoing labor shortages while American troops slowly returned from overseas. Changed their designation from prisoners of war to disarmed enemy forces, legal technicality that allowed extended detention despite Geneva Convention technically ending at war's conclusion. The Germans felt betrayed. War over, we should go home, but they remained in camps, continued working American projects, earned their 80 cents per day, while families in Germany starved. Letters from home painted increasingly desperate pictures, destroyed cities, food shortages and chaos under occupation. The prisoners could do nothing but work and wait, and worry. Some actually preferred staying in America, despite wanting to go home. Germany in 1945 and early 1946 was hell. Divided between Soviet and Allied occupation zones, infrastructure destroyed, economy collapsed, millions homeless. At least in Oklahoma they had food, shelter, safety. Felt terrible guilt about having those things while families suffered, but couldn't deny the reality that American captivity was better than German freedom in 1946. The dam work wound down through 1945, most clearing completed, maintenance reduced, fewer prisoners needed. Powell Camp closed summer 1945, buildings dismantled, equipment sold at auction, land returned to private use. Tishomingo Camp closed soon after. The Spillway Camp remained operational into early 1946, housing the last Germans working final details on drainage systems and park facilities. Then finally January 1946, the last group left. Loaded onto trucks, transported to trains, began the long journey back across America to East Coast ports. From there ships to Europe, most stopping in France or Britain first, where prisoners did reconstruction work before final return to Germany. Some didn't reach home until late 1946 or even 1947, years after the war ended, years separated from families. Manfred, the German sergeant, finally left Camp Denison, January 1946, transferred to Fannin Camp north of Tyler for a few months, then shipped to England where he worked reconstruction projects before final release, February 26, 1948. Nearly 4 years as prisoner, 3 of those after Germany surrendered. When he finally reached home, he found his family alive but struggling, his father's business destroyed, his mother's health broken by stress. Spent years rebuilding, using skills he'd learned in American camps, drawing on experiences that had complicated his understanding of enemies and allies. The Denison Dam project was officially completed, began full operation for flood control and power generation. First hydroelectric turbine came online March 1945, second unit operational September 1949. The dam immediately proved its worth, controlling spring floods that would have devastated downstream communities, generating electricity for rural areas, creating recreation opportunities that boosted regional economy. Lake Texoma became one of the most popular recreation destinations in the Southwest within years of completion. Fishing, boating, swimming, camping. The cleared shoreline the Germans had worked on became parks and campgrounds and marinas. The stone-lined drainage ditches they'd built by hand remained functional, still directing water exactly as Corps engineers had designed. Physical evidence of their labor lasting decades, mostly invisible to visitors who never knew enemy soldiers had helped build it. The economic impact was enormous. The lake attracted millions of visitors annually, generated revenue for surrounding communities, supported thousands of jobs in tourism and recreation industries. The hydroelectric power provided clean, renewable energy. The flood control protected billions of dollars in property and infrastructure. The water supply supported agricultural and municipal needs across the region. And underneath all that success, buried in historical records, documented in Corps of Engineers reports, preserved in family memories and prisoner diaries, was the story of 600 German soldiers who'd helped make it happen. Young men from Rommel's Afrika Korps who'd cleared 30,000 acres of trees and brush, who'd built drainage systems that still function today, who'd contributed labor to a project that continues serving its purposes 8 decades later. Some returned decades later to see what they'd built. Brought families, showed children and grandchildren where they'd been held, where they'd worked, what they'd helped create. Stood at overlooks staring across the massive reservoir, trying to reconcile memories of clearing that land with the reality of water covering everything. Most felt pride despite the circumstances, understood they'd contributed to something important, something lasting. American veterans who'd worked with the prisoners had similar complicated feelings. Proud of completing the dam project during wartime, but uncomfortable with some aspects of how it happened. Glad they'd treated prisoners fairly, but aware of the moral ambiguities involved in using enemy labor. The simple wartime narrative of good versus evil didn't fit their experiences, left them with memories that resisted easy categorization. That's the real story of Denison Dam and the German prisoners who helped build it. Not a simple tale of American engineering or wartime necessity, but a complicated truth about enemies working together under extraordinary circumstances. About young men far from home contributing to infrastructure that would outlast the war that brought them there. About relationships forming across the deepest divides despite everything working against connection. About the unexpected humanity that emerges when war forces people together in ways that challenge simple narratives and reveal more complicated truths about who we are and what we're capable of when circumstances demand it. A truth that matters today as much as it did then, reminding us that even between enemies, basic human decency remains possible if we choose it. That the boundaries we draw between us and them are less absolute than we want to believe, that working together toward common goals can happen even in the darkest circumstances, and that sometimes the most important lessons come from examining the complicated gray areas where simple stories fail and honest complexity reveals deeper truths about war and peace and the humans caught between them. The legacy of those German prisoners lives on in ways most Lake Texoma visitors never realize. Every time someone drives across the dam on Highway 91, every time floodwaters get controlled by the massive reservoir, every time someone fishes from shores the prisoners cleared or swims in water held back by the dam they supported, the legacy continues whether anyone knows it or not. But before I conclude, if this story surprised you, if it made you think about things you hadn't considered, then give the video a thumbs up. Share it with somebody. Tell your friends. Tell your family. These stories matter. They're part of who we are. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. I'm committed to researching deeply and also telling you what I witnessed and heard about World War II. And if you've got stories of your own, stories about that war or any other time, write them down. Tell them to somebody. Don't let them disappear. History isn't just what's in books. It's what we remember, what we pass along, what we refuse to let die. Local historians worked to document the POW contributions before that generation passed away completely, interviewed elderly residents who remembered watching trainloads of Germans arriving. Talked to families who had relatives working as guards or supervisors, gathered photographs and documents and personal accounts, created archives preserving stories that would otherwise be lost to time. The camps themselves left almost no physical trace, few concrete foundations, remains of a water well at Powell, nothing else marking where 600 Germans lived for 18 months. The land returned to agricultural use, farmers planting crops where prisoners once bunked. Only memory preserves what was there. Oral histories and written records documenting what happened. But the dam itself stands as permanent monument to everyone who built it. American engineers who designed it, construction workers who moved 18 million cubic yards of earth, German prisoners who cleared 30,000 acres. All their contributions merged into achievement that continues serving purposes its builders intended. The complications of how it got built add depth to the story, make it more human and more honest. My Uncle Jim kept a small wooden carving until he died, figure barely 2 inches tall, carved by a German prisoner during evening hours. The German gave it to Jim in 1945, gesture of thanks for fair treatment during difficult times. Jim never knew the prisoner's name, never maintained contact after repatriation. But he kept that carving 40 years. Reminder that even between enemies, basic decency remains possible. That boundaries between us and them are less absolute than we believe, that working together can happen in darkest times, and that truth emerges from examining complicated spaces where enemies discovered common ground, building something outlasting war itself. A truth that still matters today, across all the decades since German boys from North Africa cleared Oklahoma land for an American dam that tamed it.